Trade tensions between the U.S. and China are intensifying yet again ahead of President Trump's expected meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping later this month. The latest escalation follows Beijing saying it will tighten its control of the country's rare earth mineral exports. Earlier today, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent slammed the move, saying it threatens the global economy.
Make no mistake, this is China versus the world. They have put these unacceptable export controls on the entire world. China is a command and control economy, and we and our allies will neither be commanded nor controlled. They are a state economy, and we are not going to let a group of bureaucrats in Beijing try to manage the global supply chain.
Something extraordinary is happening across the African continent, and the world's biggest powers didn't see it coming. For decades, global analysts, Western policymakers, and major economic institutions viewed Africa as a region that would eventually become important. They predicted slow growth, limited influence, and a distant timeline before African nations could make major moves on the world stage. But now, in real time, that prediction has collapsed. Because Africa has just revealed something the world wasn't ready for: a coordinated, multi-sector, multi-nation shift in economic power, trade leverage, and strategic alignment, all unfolding far faster than expected. And this wasn't triggered by one country, not one event, not one discovery. It was a chain reaction, years in the making, that the world underestimated. Washington didn't anticipate the speed. Europe didn't anticipate the scale. China didn't anticipate the competition. And global markets did not anticipate the shockwaves. Africa is no longer the future. Africa is now. And this video explains exactly why. Today, we break down the moment global analysts realized they miscalculated. The moment the United States realized it had fallen behind. The moment the world said, "Wait, how did Africa just do that?" This is the full story, the real, data-driven, geopolitical breakdown of how Africa surprised the entire world. For years, U.S. foreign policy toward Africa was built on outdated assumptions. Analysts viewed Africa mainly through humanitarian lenses, security concerns, or long-term development strategies, not as a competitive global economic force. But while those reports were being written, Africa was quietly shifting into a new gear. Across the continent, several things happened simultaneously. 1. A new generation of leadership emerged. Younger, economically focused leaders began pushing for large-scale reforms and global partnerships driven not by aid, but by investment and industry. 2. Regional blocs strengthened. Organizations like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, accelerated cooperation and reduced barriers. For Washington, this was unexpected. Analysts predicted AfCFTA would take many years before showing measurable results. But the early progress was far faster. 3. Africa became the center of global competition. The US, China, Europe, Russia, Turkey, India, and Gulf nations all began competing to secure African markets, resources, and strategic influence. But every major power underestimated Africa's negotiating power. They believed Africa would choose sides. Instead, African nations chose leverage. 4. The global economy shifted toward resources. Africa controlled clean energy, minerals, agricultural capacity, technology, manufacturing potential, and labor force. Demographics all aligned in Africa's favor. While Washington debated policy frameworks, Africa moved directly into action, attracting investment, building infrastructure, and negotiating deals with stronger conditions and greater independence. 5. The world hit a demographic wall, except Africa. Population decline in Europe, the US, Japan, and China changed everything. Africa became the only region with the workforce to power the next century. Washington didn't see the convergence of these factors, at least not at this scale, not at this speed. And this miscalculation created the first major shock. What happened next was even more surprising. African nations launched several trade and logistics projects that shifted the global map. New East-West transport corridors. Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Egypt invested heavily in shipping routes, ports, and industrial hubs. Their networks began redirecting parts of global trade, especially between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. West African processing boom. Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, and Nigeria began pushing for local processing in cocoa, oil, gas, and minerals. The world expected slow implementation. Instead, investors rushed in, accelerating timelines dramatically. North African energy pivots. Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, and Libya expanded gas pipelines, solar megaprojects, and electricity export deals. Europe was caught off guard. U.S. analysts missed the timing. China misjudged how competitive North African markets would become. AfCFTA digital trade platform. The surprise wasn't the creation, it was the speed of adoption. Thousands of businesses across dozens of African nations began trading easier and faster than predicted. Washington didn't factor this into its global trade forecasts, which typically assumed Africa would remain fragmented. In geopolitics, alliances define influence, and Africa changed the landscape faster than expected. The Gulf Africa axis strengthened. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar dramatically increased investment in ports, energy, agriculture, and fintech. India, Africa partnerships expanded. India began competing directly with China by investing in digital infrastructure and trade routes. BRICS influence surged. African participation in BRICS talks reshaped global finance expectations. Europe returned, but late France, Germany, and Italy attempted to rebuild their African relationships. But African nations were now negotiating from a stronger position. The United States began losing ground. Washington underestimated how quickly African nations would expand local industries, build regional trade networks, attract capital from new partners, establish independent foreign policy strategies. For the first time, the global South, with Africa at the center, began influencing world order. This wasn't symbolic. It was measurable. What Africa just revealed, the part Washington didn't expect, is this: Africa is no longer reacting to global power. Africa is shaping it. Not through one headline, not through one event, but through a layered, strategic, coordinated set of moves that create a new reality. 1. Africa is now a priority market for every major power. Not optional, essential. 2. Africa's demographic advantage has become the defining factor of the 21st century. 3. Resource wealth plus processing capability equals massive leverage. 4. Africa can now shape global supply chains. 5. African nations have more negotiating power than ever in history. These factors combine into one message to the world: Africa is not the future. Africa is the present. And that is the reveal Washington didn't expect. Africa just surprised the entire world, not because it suddenly became powerful overnight, but because global powers misread the pace of Africa's rise. The United States, Europe, and even China expected a slow ascent. Instead, Africa made strategic moves that compressed decades of progress into a few years. Trade networks expanded. Alliances deepened. Industries grew. Investment diversified. Negotiation power increased. And now, global politics must adjust. Africa is not stepping into the world order. Africa is reshaping it. This is the moment the world realized: Africa's rise is not just happening, it is accelerating. And no one, not even Washington, can afford to ignore it.